This is truly extraordinary. If a number of you have already done this, but if you don't mind turning on your video to give really a sense of the community that's here, that would be wonderful. No pressure though. Um, and I wanted to say too that what we had anticipated, my name is Christine Hong, by the way, and I am the chair of the new department in critical race and ethnic studies. We had anticipated that we in the CRES community would be welcoming Fui into our midst, but we see that actually Fui's community is welcoming CRES into your midst, and we are so honored to be among all of you and to have Fui so graciously visiting us virtually for today and tomorrow. I wanted to say, and I'm imagining that Fui needs very little introduction here, but I will say that Dr. Fui Lupe Niumeitolu is a Tongan Pacific Islander, Oceanian scholar, storyteller, and community organizer. And as you all know so well, there is a seamlessness of spirit, courage, and commitment that characterizes both her research and her community work, whether it be on issues of climate and environmental justice, ending violence against women, prison abolition and transformative justice, and building radical solidarities with California American Indian tribes to protect sacred native sites in Oceania and here in California, or as she so evocatively puts it, from Moana Nui to the West Berkeley Shell Mound. Having earned her PhD from UC Berkeley's Ethnic Studies Department in 2019, she currently holds a UC President's Postdoctoral Fellowship in the Native American Studies Department at UC Davis, where she also facilitates the Oceania Research Working Group. Dr. Niumeitolu is at work on 2 book manuscripts. The first is titled The Mana of the Tongan Every Day, Surviving Genealogies of White Terror and Remembering Va, from which we have had a chance to look at some of her writing, and also a book of poetry and creative nonfiction, Looking for Hine Nui Tepo, Honoring Our Mother. And here, oh, hello, yeah. Here I'm reminded of the fact that one of the initiatives that we have that is underway is a creative CRES initiative that weaves together critical scholarship and research and creative expression. You see this so beautifully in Fui's work. She has a staggering number of forthcoming essays, all due to be published in 2022. There's 7 essays to be exact, including in a special issue of Amerasia in the journal Pacific Art, and in edited book collections, including Home in the Bay Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, Teaching Oceania, Visualizing Change, Resisting Violence, Environmental Humanities in Oceania and the Pacific Islands, and in Pacific Islander Literature and the Environment. Many of these issues and volumes, some of which are public facing and the others academic, were edited by Pacific Islander scholars, and they speak to the transfigurative nature of Indigenous feminist scholarship in particular in shaping Pacific Islander studies as a profound arena of decolonial thought, research, and praxis. Fui is part of the Segura Te Land Trust, an urban, indigenous, woman-led organization that rematriates, as many of you well know, indigenous lands back to indigenous peoples. And she hosts the popular Segura Te Seeding Hope speaker series that features prominent indigenous leaders, activists, and artists from the United States and the Pacific and Pacific/Oceania. And this series is amazing, as some of you know from having been a part of this. I mean, the reach is so broad and the conversations are so dynamic. I also want to note that throughout the years, Fuli has visited Santa Cruz on a number of occasions, including in deep solidarity with the Amamutsun tribal band on whose unceded ancestral lands our campus is located. It is a very deep honor to have this opportunity to learn from and to welcome wholeheartedly Fuli to our community and us as well to your community. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Professor Hong, Timalo. Okonga bitogolato. Konga bitogolato he hon. You know, relatives, beloved relatives, my heart is so full. My heart is so full. And Professor Hong, I wanted to say thank you so much to you and to the department. And actually, I will do that as also part of our conversation today and as part of the presentation. So, you know, relatives, as many of you probably know that, you know, I can tell several stories. So in my mind, I'm saying, Fuli, right now, don't do the, you know, the Tongan Oceanian storytelling, you know, practices. Right now, stick with a Western, you know, very linear essay format that you have in front of you, because I'm seeing so many of you relatives, beloved relatives, right? And my heart is so full. If we were meeting in person, of course, we would have some food, right? And I see the Fijians there, and I don't want to offend them. So we will definitely have to have some really good kava, okay? So relatives, I'm gonna do it in a Western linear timeline kind of thing here. I'm gonna read the presentation, and also in the presentation, I'm gonna thank you. Okay, so the beginning here. So, sorry, I was getting so emotional there that I forgot to put up my own PowerPoint. So here we go. Oops. So relatives, before beginning the land acknowledgement, right, that we always begin our meetings off with, that includes welcoming all of you to the space, I want to highlight that what is often termed as a land acknowledgement here in the US is actually for us Tongans and Pacific Islanders, as well as for other indigenous peoples, a ceremony. And it is a ceremony of great importance because it is a spatiality for tracing, remembering, and honoring genealogies and spatialities of relationalities, or to the land, or the land acknowledgement is to materialize the ancient original teaching and methodologies that we Tongans and some other Pacific Islander nations term as Dauhiba. Right here. So Dawi, so in our Tongan pronunciation, just for those of you who are here who may not be aware, is that the T is a D, right? So how we would say Tonga, we would say Tonga, right? So T over there, so it would be Dauhiba. Let's see, where am I at? Okay, hang in there. See, I always knew that this linear thing doesn't work, right? Okay, let me find this that we call Dauhiba. The word Dauhi means caring or nourishing, and Va is described by the Samoan scholar and poet Albert Wend as, quote, the space between, the betweenness, not empty space, not space that separates, but space that relates, end of quote. Correspondingly, the Tongan scholar and poet Ganai Helufaman defines Dauhiba as, quote, an important relationship of nurturing interpersonal relations. And it is inclusive of multiple dimensions that include simultaneously the physical, the cultural, and the spiritual. In addition, and offering important contributions to this conversation is First Nations scholar Leanne Simpson. She offers the Nishnabeg term called please forgive me, Gini Nishnabeg Oga Mig, that delineates spatialities that are, quote, in deep relationship to each other, end of quote. Furthermore, Simpson writes, quote, it is a web of connections to each other, to the plant nations, the animal nations, the rivers and the lakes, the cosmos, and to our neighboring indigenous nations. Gina Nishnabeg Oganimik is an ecology of intimacy. Thus, the Tongan original teaching and methodology, Dauhiva, delineates, quote, ecologies of intimacies that, quote, relates, and vast spatialities of relationalities that not only connect us to each other and to other human beings, but they circle and are rooted in the natural world, the whanua, the land, our Mother Earth. And the word whanua also defines our umbilical cords, highlighting our inextricable connections to the natural world, the whanua, our mother. In addition, for us Tongans, the natural world also centers as well as it's centered in the body of our mother, the great Moana, spatialities of salt water, the Pacific Ocean. Invoking an important reminder from one of our beloved ancestors of Oceania and Pacific Island studies, the late, great Teresia Tewa. She highlights our intimate vow with the Moana. Quote, she reminds us, relatives, we cry and sweat salt water, so we know that the ocean is really in our blood, end of quote. Thus, the whanua and Moana are cosmologies that we defined as the sacred. And in addition, the natural world are the core of our Tongan systems of social relationalities, kinships, and lifelines. As a Tongan scholar and daughter of Moana Nui is the indigenous term for the Pacific, Polynesia for the Pacific. Dauhiva is an original instruction and methodology that I center, and I use it to guide my research, service, and teaching. And I will return back to discussions of Dauhiva throughout this presentation. Okay. Here we go, next one. Okay, so finally our land acknowledgements, everybody. So the first acknowledgements of Dauhiva that I want to offer is to the body of land that hosts the University of California, Santa Cruz. The University of California, Santa Cruz is on the unceded and occupied land of the Awaswa tribes. And I want to honor the contemporary indigenous stewards of this land, the Amamutsan tribe. O kuatu heni ai whakatulo atu. Te mo whakamalo atu. Whakamalo atu. Whakamalo malunga atu. Malo e tahi o tawa. On the land that hosts UC Santa Cruz, I also want to offer acknowledgements to the whanua, also means our bodies, of the Oceania Pacific Island scholars and visionaries that came before me. My work stands on the shoulders of the Native Pacific Islander intellectuals who planted the seeds for the inception of Pacific Island studies here in the United States as these essential discourses for dreaming decolonial futurities. Their work, which paved the path at UC Santa Cruz, brings me here today. I honor the legacy created by the late and beloved Dr. Teresia Tewa, which includes the efforts of Dr. J. Kehawani Kawanui and Dr. Vince Diaz. I also extend this acknowledgement of Dauhiva to one of our most respected and beloved feminist ancestors, the Chicana scholar, Gloria Ansaldúa. E kainga, malo e ngā ue, kautoa, malo e ngā ue kautoa. Pea malo e tauhi o taua. On the land that hosts UC Santa Cruz relatives, I also want to acknowledge and Dauhiva with the faculty, the staff, and the students at the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Department at this university. I want to thank them for including me and bringing me here today for this Talanoa space, for this space of conversation. As you all know well, ethnic studies relatives, ours is a shared struggle against settler colonialisms and its values of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy that are death sentences for our children and for our communities. Relatives, thank you for your courageous resistance. In addition, I also Dauhiva and acknowledge our ethnic studies ancestors that were and are at the forefront of various social movements that culminated in the creation of the first ethnic studies program that began at San Francisco State University in 1969. Kainga, malo ngawe puke fonua, be malo e Dauhi Tauva. The next acknowledgement of Dauhiva that I want to offer is to the body of land called Huichin. And this is a land now known within settler colonial maps as Alameda County or the East Bay, that includes the city of Oakland, the land that I make my new home. Huichin is the unceded and occupied territory of the Lishan Ohlone tribe. I have the great honor of living about 2 miles from the first Lishan Ohlone Arbor, or prayer house and sacred site, built on this territory in the past 250 years. Relatives, for me as a Tongan, this is one of the most humbling experiences. So as we continue our ceremony of Dauhiva and land acknowledgements, I want to humbly recognize that Huichin is the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. So relatives, I also recognize there is some contention on that, okay, but we won't get to that right now, okay? It's just, I can see there are some scholars here who might also dispute that, okay? But here in Huichin, we're very proud of our va with the Black Panther movement, a Black power political movement that centered Black self-determination. And before I continue, I want to briefly draw connections that highlight one of the contemporary genealogical connections or ecologies of intimacies and Dauhiva shared between Huichin, right, this land right here, and Moananui, or the Pacific. So something really exciting that just happened is that currently our relatives in Aotearoa, or what is now known as New Zealand, are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Polynesian Panthers. The Polynesian Panthers was a revolutionary social justice movement founded by young Polynesians with the aims to refuse white supremacist and xenophobic, campaigns that targeted the bodies of communities of working class, Indigenous Maori and Pacific Islanders in Auckland, New Zealand in the 1970s, continuing until the 1990s. As the Polynesian Panthers' name indicates, and what is often erased from the mainstream telling of their narrative, is that the histories of Dauhiva and their genealogies of struggles and political allegiances to the US and Oakland-based Black Panther movement. The Polynesian Panthers were inspired, mentored, and they worked collaboratively with the Black Panther movement. One of the core issues at the center of the founding of the Polynesian Panther movement was the New Zealand government's deployment of the dawn raids. This was a state-sanctioned phenomenon of police violence that took place in the early morning hours when families and communities, right, especially working class families, right, the morning is such an important time. Many people are just getting in, or that's the only moment of sleep most people have before a long, maybe 14-hour shift, right? So this is when the communities are at the most vulnerable. So what happened is that the police disproportionately targeted Pacific Islander communities, Maori and Pacific Island communities, or what the New Zealand government justified and termed as immigrant overstayers. Although ironically, according to the studies, the majority of the overstayers in Aotearoa were from European countries. In addition, it's important to highlight that this 50th anniversary was monumental because the New Zealand government and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern recently issued a formal and unreserved apology to Indigenous Maori and Pacific people for the Dawn raids. And they are working with Maori and Pacifica leaders to create systemic changes that can help to redress the horror of the violence that ravaged and continues to ravage these communities. So relatives, I returned back to the body of land called Huchen to tell about a moment of Dauhiva that took place in 2017 at Marcus Books, a Black-owned bookstore. At this moment, I stood alongside Lishan Ohlone Tribal Chair Karina Gold and with Native Hawaiian leader Kumukawi Peralta, the young Samoan queer artist Jean Malasene, and my sister Laura Niumeitolu to help welcome many of the esteemed members of the Polynesian Panthers and the Black Panther Party. Members of the Polynesian Panthers traveled from Aotearoa, New Zealand to Huchen to help celebrate the 50th anniversary exhibition honoring the Black Panther Party at the Oakland Museum. Since this initial meeting, I've had the great joy of staying in touch with many of the core members of the Polynesian Panthers, and I've also had the great honor of working with them on various social justice projects throughout the years. In addition, one of the themes of our conversation in the past year has been centered around our dream to organize a symposium and correspondingly, of course, publications, right, that will highlight the histories and legacies of Dauhiva shared between the Polynesian Panthers and the Black Panther Party. The preparation for this symposium can also include undergraduate and graduate courses, colloquiums, and inclusive of a visiting and exchange scholar, artist, and culture practitioner program between California and Aotearoa, New Zealand. I humbly hope that this unprecedented and transnational symposium that will center cutting edge theories and discussions in the fields of Black studies, Pacific studies, and Indigenous studies will be hosted by the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Department at UC Santa Cruz. Lastly, my last land acknowledgements, every relatives, and thank you so much for your patience. Lastly, but definitely not least, my last land acknowledgement of Dauhiva is with all of you, beloved relatives that are here today. I want to humbly honor and thank you. I want to thank you. Malo mo me amai he ahoni, be malo e mau ofa, be mau koloa. I recognize the long distant voyages that many of you took to be here. Many of you came from our ancestral homelands in Oceania. That includes our lands of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. I also recognize that many of you here, beloved relatives, also trace your ancestral homelands back to Kashmir, Pakistan, Palestine, Mexico. And from other distant lands, please forgive me for not mentioning them here, Ireland. From other distant lands that represent the four corners of our Mother Earth. Beloved relatives, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for your commitment to be here. You're so busy and you have such important lives. Thank you so much for sharing your time. And not just when I say malo, malo and maukoloa to you, I'm also saying it to your beloved ancestors that bring you here. I want to acknowledge them. And in this space of ceremony, I want to say thank you to them for connecting our journeys in this lifetime. So the thesis for the presentation today. So this presentation examines Tongan race, gender, and sexualities produced through a colonial phenomenon that a colonial archive, excuse me, and I got that from just a wonderful mentor who gave me that correction. So I just wanted to say that. It's a colonial archive that I term as March of Surrender. The March of Surrender highlights the quintessential objectives of white terror in the Pacific island nation of Tonga and also here in California. And I argue that what is at center, the quintessential goal of white terror, is the desecration of the sacred. I redefine white terror as a racialized violence aimed to produce colonial systems of kinships and social relationalities by surveilling colonial institutions of gender, sexualities, and families. This new status quo is produced as well as maintained through the normalization of violence against the bodies of Tongan women and girls. Correspondingly, I argue the scope of white terror is inextricably tied to the expropriation of the Tongan natural world, the whanua, the land, our Mother Earth, our umbilical cords, and to the moana, our great mother, the Pacific Ocean, spatialities of salt water. These cosmologies are often delineated as feminine and located at the core of what we defined as the sacred. Considering what Ohlone Costanoan writer Deborah Miranda terms as the quote genealogy of violence, I trace two contemporary renditions of March of Surrender and consider how they stem from early 19th century and extend to the present. I begin by looking at marches of surrender. They took place in 2015 in Tonga to protest women's rights. Okay, so this was a big demonstrations, excuse me, a lot of them, led by the Tongan Christian Churches Forum. Additionally, I also turned to the diaspora in 2019. Tongans, intergenerational Tongan families were standing with the Mormon Church to protect the institution of heteropatriarchy by supporting Proposition 8. And then lastly, everyone, if you're still here, we turn to Tongan Futurities in the East Bay, California, to highlight the decolonial marches produced by Tongan and Pacific Islander arrivals. Right? I conclude with examples of regenerative refusal to the March of Surrender. Specifically, our commitment to stand as, quote, allies and accomplices with the Lishan Ohlone tribe, the indigenous stewards of this land, in their work to protect their indigenous sacred sites from desecration. Okay, so, relatives, before we go on, I just thought I should, throw up a little, imagery here of Oceania, so so we can get a fair idea perhaps of what I'm talking about. I also recognize, of course, that there are so many island nations. Right? When I was looking at this too, there are so many island nations that are not represented in this particular Western way of telling Oceania, right? And so, of course, all of these different problematics of cartographies. But I just wanted to show perhaps where Tonga is at, right? So that folks could see it. Also, as you can see, our close neighbors too, Fiji, Fijians, of course, always think they're better than us. And then you have, of course, Samoa. Now, the Samoans definitely think they're the better ones. And then, of course, our wonderful relatives up there on the top there that you can see from Hawaii, right? So Polynesia is usually, so let me go back. Oceania relatives is a term, it's a term of self-determination, right? It's a term of self-determination. It's a naming. It's a naming of a region, more than just a region, because as we know, these are cosmologies. It is a naming of a people. It is a naming against the invisibility of a people, a histories, a cosmologies. right? And so this was a term that was given to us by our beloved, the late and great Professor Ed Billy Howell Ofa, right? And the term Oceania was an important term because he said, and actually I want to point this out, Ed Billy Howell Ofa actually created this because his students, right, at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji, came to him, right? I imagine they came to him during office hours and they said, Professor, we're not seen, we're so invisible in this global view, right? So this is one of the motivations. He wanted to give the young people, he wanted to give what Indigenous people call the next 7 generations. He wanted to give us and them hope, right? So Oceania is also a methodology, because what he said is that the ways that the West sees us, it only sees us as these small, disparate islands, right? That were inconsequential within the Western imagination. But what he says is that if we look at ourselves using, right, if we use the Western gaze, we're gonna see ourselves as these small, disparate islands. But if we look at ourselves like our ancestors did, right, we Pacific people of Mauna Nui, we're the largest body of water on our Mother Earth. So he says, let us use our own indigenous, cultural, traditional knowledges. Let us use our own cosmologies to reclaim our self-determination, because this is who we are. Instead of these small, disparate, small islands, nothingness of smallness, quote unquote, that the West sees us, all this grandeur is who we are. So I talk a little bit about white terror in this next section, just laying out some of the theoretical framework that I use. So my theorizing, and also I really ground the Tongan methodology, again, of Tauhiva in my theorizing of white terror. So my theorizing of the phenomenon of white terror is grounded, as I just said, in the Tongan methodology of Tauhiva. And relatives, I'm in conversation with the renowned post-colonial scholar, Frantz Fanon. Really thank that ancestor as well for his important work. I redefine white terror as a racialized violence aimed to produce crisis and imbalance to the Tongan lifelines, kinships, systems of social relationalities that are rooted in the feminine, the sacred. White terror aimed to supplant indigenous lifelines with the colonial institutions of gender, sexualities, families, and intimacies. And at the core, they privileged the colonial institution of heteropatriarchy. Thus, this surveillance extends to the very intimate contours of private relationalities, desires, and the minutiae of everyday Tongan life. This new status quo is produced as well as maintained through the normalization of violence against the bodies of Tongan women and girls. And correspondingly, the scope of white terror is inextricably tied and rooted in the expropriation of the Tongan natural world, the whanua, land, Mother Earth, umbilical cord, and our mother, our great mother, the Moana. These cosmologies, again, are defined as feminine and or outside of the Western, and outside of the Western gender binary. And they are what we considered and defined as a sacred. Correspondingly, I argue that the quintessential objective of white terror is a desecration of the sacred. I turn to Frantz Fanon's seminal work, Wretched of the Earth, where he profoundly deconstructs the white colonizers' insatiable desire for power by identifying the psychological roots of this desire as a European methodology, quote, perverted logic. Fanon contends that the, quote, perverted logic of the European colonizer that undergird the colonial project is unrelenting and insatiable in its desires to subjugate the native. Quote, Perhaps we have not sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not simply content to impose its rule upon the present and the future, end of quote, because this is not enough. And to further demonstrate the insatiable appetite of European colonizers, he states, quote, colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content, end of quote. Because according to his analysis, the colonizers deployed a strategy that is methodical and strategic, and it turns to the past of the oppressed people, and it distorts, disfigures, and destroys it, end of quote. The Tongan past of the colonial project unrelentingly, quote, distorts, disfigures, and destroys is the sacred, the feminine, the heartbeat of Tonganness. Fanon continues his arguments by reminding us that the strategies and methodologies deployed by colonizers to subjugate the natives were strategic and not, quote, left to chance. In addition, and perhaps most significantly, the colonial desires for domination, born out of what he posits is the colonizers', quote, perverted logic, demanded unfettered dominion of the, quote, the total, end of quote, scope, contour, and interceding into every crevice of the native's life. Thus, the colonial project desired all of the native, all some, all quote unquote total, and they refused to settle for even just a partial dominion. The colonial project's objective for the total subjugation of the native strategically aimed to define the native's past by marginalizing it, devaluing pre-colonial history, a technology that Ebeli Hau'ofa, okay, let's go back, Hau'ofa documents transpired in Tonga and in the Pacific region that resulted in the severing of indigenous time and space into two dichotomous spatialities. Quote, the era of darkness associated with savagery and barbarianism, and the privileged era of light and civilization, ushered in by Christianity, end of quote. Frantz Fanon's arguments are in agreement with Hau'ofa. He states, quote, devaluing of pre-colonial history, end of quote, that included the systemic denigration and the criminalization of the, quote, customs of the colonized people. Their traditions, their myths are the very sign of that poverty of spirit and of their constitutional depravity, end of quote. In my book projects and other writing projects, I'm in conversation with Fanon, and I contribute to his theory of perverted logic by centering the Tongan original instruction and methodology of Tauhiva, as well as I privilege gender, sexualities, and Tongan, Native, and Black feminisms as methodological lenses and histories that can help to expand and enrich the discussion. I use the important theories of Native and Indigenous feminist scholars, such as J. Kehaulani Kawanui, Christine Taitano Delisle, Cindy Cruz, and Amy Lonetree, to help ground and enrich my analysis. And I also reach and include the important contributions of Black feminist historians, Jessica Marie Johnson, Crystal Ann Feimster, including the contributions of my Cal alumni, wonderful folk, Yomara Figueroa, and also Omiseke Natasha Tinsley of the Black diaspora and Black queer studies. In my conversation with Fanon, I tracked the historical maneuvers of white terror in Tonga and in California to show that the intentions of perverted logic was not just racialized, but it was in fact and unequivocally gendered. In addition, I argued that the aim of white terror was not just to subjugate Tonganness in the past, with its objectives extending to the present moment, but I emphatically show that the perverted logic of white terror in Tonga is seeped in its unrelenting preoccupation with the surveillance of Tongan futurities and the expansion of the objectives and the themes of settler colonialism in Tonga and in the Tongan diaspora. So relatives, I can see the time is moving here. I'm absolutely not doing a good, I'm not doing well with this Western time. Okay, I'm just gonna go through things just really quickly. So thank you everybody for bearing with me here, because I know that the talk really is supposed to go until 3 o'clock. And then you guys are supposed to ask me some really easy, simple questions after that, just really simple ones, right? I just wanna remind you. Okay, so I started with a contemporary rendition of the March of Surrender. This is the contemporary rendition. In this next section, I examine contemporary renditions of March of Surrender. I'm going to go through this one really quickly. Please forgive me. I'm going to go through this. So I begin by looking at a contemporary rendition of March of Surrender that took place in Tonga in May 2015. Right, and these photographs are from downtown, the Tongan capital, the capital city of Tonga, which is Nuku'alofa. So in another publication, I write, May 2015 was a time of political excitement in the streets of downtown Nuku'alofa, the capital city. Hundreds of Tongans, including intergenerational families, ranging from elders to young children, along with exuberant youth marching bands, all dressed in their Sunday best tupenu and ta'avala, joined together and marched the streets, united in a movement led by the Tongan Churches Forum, a coalition of Tongan Christian leaders, consisting mostly of men, to publicly demonstrate their opposition to the Tongan government's aim to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of all forms of violence, which is called CEDAW. Okay? The Tongan Churches Forum's impassioned demonstrations were front lines rooted in their fear that CEDAW would alter the Tongan status quo and lead to the erosion of heteropatriarchal power by creating new laws allowing women to own land, allow the legalization of same-sex marriage, and it would grant Tongan women reproduction rights. All three of these major women's rights are currently illegal in contemporary Tonga. On the other hand, our good sisters, our Tongan women's rights leaders, by contrast, highly publicized the urgency for Tongan lawmakers to support the ratification of CEDAW because they wanted to save Tongan women's lives. They were responding to a national study on domestic violence conducted in 2019 and released in 2012, showing that 77% of Tongan women are physically or sexually abused, and 1 in 4 Tongan women experience violence in their lifetime. I jump now to California, right? In California in 2009, I show some photographs here. These are photographs taken from the Los Angeles Times. And these images in 2019 are taken in front of the Mormon temples in Oakland and Los Angeles, California, during the Proposition 8 campaigns. Proposition 8, as many of you know, was a California ballot proposition and a state constitutional amendment that aimed to criminalize same-sex relationalities and to institutionalize heteropatriarchy through the institution of heterosexual marriage, right? And so Proposition 8 passed in November 2008 in the state elections and was later overturned in court. In addition, the proposition was produced and financially supported by opponents of women's rights and LGBT rights, such as many Christian fundamentalist institutions that also included the US-based Mormon Church, one of the world's most wealthiest and powerful religious institutions. Relatives, but before I continue with the conversation, with the presentation, I just wanted to briefly share some historical background on some of the genealogies of violence that connect the contemporary relationalities between the US-based Mormon Church and Tonganese. The US military occupation in Tonga and the Pacific during World War II drastically altered the Tongan political landscape, creating a dispossession that Tongan people suffered through myriad losses. But perhaps one of the most harmful ways that Tongans suffered was that the US empire's production of economic povertization that was produced by the implementation of new laws and regulations and restrictions on Tongan people's access to the whanua and to the moana, that left many Tongans very few options but to participate in US capitalism and become dependent on US currency, foods, and goods for their survival of their family. Furthermore, as I have argued in other research projects, this historical moment, right, this is after 1945, opened the door and allowed for not only the entrance, but it allowed for the expansion of the US-based Mormon Church, enabling it to take its place at the center of the Tongan political arena and to rise to unprecedented prominence and authority in Tonga and throughout the Pacific. So that's a train in the back there. I live in East Oakland, everybody. So Tonga and other Pacific Island nations such as Samoa, the Cook Islands, and Fiji are in the list of the top 10 nations hosting the largest Mormon conversion and baptism into the world, on the global level. So I returned back to the 2009 March of Surrender here in California. In an essay that I'm currently working on for publication, I write about the imagery of the Tongan men that we see here, performing a contemporary March of Surrender in front of the Mormon church, in front of the Mormon temples, or sites that they now consider as sacred. I write, the mainstream media's imagery of Tonganness was enticing. The big brown bodies of our Tongan men were militarized and used as weapons to police Mormon temples, from Oakland, San Diego, Fresno, reaching all the way to LA. Tongan male bodies were deployed as front lines to draw lines of separation from the crowds of gay rights activists and ordinary community members that refuse the politics of homophobia. The images of Tonganness were depicted matter-of-factly as if they were true, as if Tonganness is what the Mormon Church has created of us, a spatiality that is devoid of gay, queer, and the feminine. As if Tonganness is a spatiality devoid of the genealogies and the constellations of Dauhiba. The mainstream media fed us endless images, but one in particular still haunts me. The image portrayed in the LA Times depicts volatile Tongan male rage, vying on the national stage against a small and Jewish lesbian woman. Yes, relatives, this image still breaks my heart. So relatives, this is what I call an origin story. And as you can see, this is from 1840. I don't have an image of it, except I have a black box there. And I want you, please, to imagine the story that I'm going to tell you. So in my book project, one of the historical archives of the March of Surrender that I examine and term as an origin story is a narrative that takes place during 1840 at a Tongan sacred site, right? It's one of the last remaining Tongan sacred sites at this time in Tongan history. The sacred site, of course, includes a temple, and it's located in a part of Tonga called Tokomololo. The 1840 March of Surrender was what Toni Morrison termed as a colonial, quote, story of success, a narrative of, quote, progress on the Western linear timeline because it transpired after the arrival of Europeans, after the space and time that Billy Hau'ofa terms as the privileged, quote, era of light. This historical moment shows Tongan men performing their loss and surrender for the British gaze. At the end of a long and violent battle, where the British massacred over 300 Tongans, and not only that, they desecrated the Tongan sacred site at Tokomololo. This horrific carnage was the punishment deployed on Tongan bodies and on Tongan land by British militaries and Christian missionaries. And this violence was the consequence. This was their punishment for fighting back to defend their beloved sacred site from desecration. The Tongan social and political landscape had undergone numerous transformations since the arrival of the London Missionary Society in the late 18th century. The violent battle that took place in 1840 at the Tongan sacred site in Tuamololo, highlights one of the most important changes that had transpired in the Tongan political landscape. At this moment in Tongan history, the renowned Tongan warrior Taufa Ahau had changed his allegiance from Tonganist. And he was now at this time leading the British military forces and the Christian missionaries in their fight against the Tongans. As the respected Tongan historian Sionelatu Kefu notes, it was in fact Taufa Ahau who led the British army to victory over Tonganness. Because as a Tongan himself, he was privy to the intimacies and the intricacies of Tonganness. And he knew better than the British colonizers that the sacred was the core and the heartbeat of Tonganness. In addition, Taufa Ahau was well aware that centering the British military objectives around the themes of desecrating the Tongan sacred would ultimately ensure victory for the British side. And it will also, excuse me, sorry guys, I made some changes in there. It would create the defeat of Tonganness. Latu Kefu documents that the British deployed a new military strategies under Taufa Ahau's council that centered precisely on the desecration of the sacred. It was, in fact, the deployment of these new strategies that profoundly changed the course of history, and they helped to propel the British side to victory. Latu Kefu continues, quote, under the leadership of King George, the Christians began to take the offensive. First in Hapai, where Taufa Ahau systemically burned down the god houses, destroyed the effigies, and turned the sacred places into gardens, end of quote. The massacre that subsequently transpired in Tokomololo was a horror created by the British military and the Christians' deployment of white terror that centered on the desecration of the Tongan sacred. And they aimed to decimate one of the last remaining Tongan sacred sites. Latu Kefu documents the historical moment, and he uses descriptions used by other early Christian missionaries to describe some of the antecedents to this horror. Quote, the incident which triggered it was the removal of some sticks from one of the god houses by some Christians, end of quote. In response, the Tongans fought back against this white terror, and they rose up to defend their sacred. And I want to add this. For the Tongans too, their sacred was inclusive of their temple. and the whanua, right? The land, the sacred land on which the temple was built. What is also the sacred? Well, the sacred elders, the medicine peoples, the dauhi, the stewards of that sacred site. Also, what is inclusive of that sacred included the human bodies, right? The human bodies, their collective vow with their beloved families and extended families and communities. This is the sacred. This is the extent of the sacred that was desecrated. Really, the sacred relatives was inclusive of all they loved and defined as Tonganese, right? The past, the present, and the dreams for the ancestors of the next 7 generations. As the story unfolds, in their resistance against the Christians' desecration of their sacred, the Tongans took the lives of 4 Tongan Christians that were fighting with Taufa Ahau on the side of the British. The consequences for the loss of the 4 Christian lives was swift and without any boundaries. And in a demonstration of unfettered cruelty, the Christians and the British under Taufa Ahau's leadership responded by deploying British armaments and firearms to ruthlessly massacre the bodies of largely unarmed 300 Tongan men, women, children, and elders. But that's not enough, right? As we can see from the definitions of white terror that Fanon, perverted logic that Fanon offers, right? That's not enough. In the wake of the massacre, British Christians framed their telling of the narrative and their deployment of the white terror as necessary to direct Tongans onto the path of progress. For example, in a letter sent back to England shortly after the massacre, an English Christian man cheerfully documented the long-awaited arrival of what he believed was divine justice and punishment for the, quote, heathen Tonga, and for their resistance against the true God, Christianity. He describes himself as overcome with enthusiasm to witness that the Tongans eventually surrendered their resistance to the, quote, true and, quote, true God, strong God, excuse me, and the Christians and the, sorry, I'm cutting down because of time, right? In another telling of this narrative, another British male Christian witness recalled that, quote, several old Tongan chiefs, end of quote, were surveilled and forced, quote, for the first time, end of quote, to desecrate their own Tongan sacred by attending, quote, the house of the Christian God, end of quote. The British demanded that Tongans, this is after this massacre, right? This is after this massacre. The British demanded that the Tongans perform a visuality highlighting their own humiliation, grief, and devastating losses, culminating in the March of Surrender. He wrote about this moment. He says, we hear this moment where the Tongans do this performance of March of Surrender. We hear that the last Sabbath was a high day, among with that several old chiefs who for the first time went to the house of the Christian God. They went dressed in the sacred mat of the heathen deity they once feared and adored, and one that of them had bored a hole in his God, right? So this was a whale tooth, designing to hang it around his neck and thus expose it, not just to himself, but to ridicule, As the statement demonstrates, the March of Surrender was a colonial visuality, a performance that demanded that the Tongan male warriors and leaders desecrate their own Tongan sacred. This performance also required that they convert immediately to Christianity and denounce their beloved Tongan gods through showing their sole allegiance to the, quote, house of the Christian God. End of quote. Furthermore, the March of Surrender forced Tongans to, quote, expose and to ridicule and publicly malign their Tongan gods and their sacred regalia, demanding that the Tongan men went, quote, dressed in the sacred mats of the heathen deity they once feared and adored, and that one of them had bored a hole in his god, a whale tooth. That is our beloved Tongan god, Hai Hai Dahi. Thus, the 1840 March of Surrender was a visuality that celebrated and legitimated the Western linear timeline of progress. And the British victory over Tonganese reinforced the belief system supporting the inevitability of the colonial institutions of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. It justified the Europeans' unrelenting and unfettered deployment of white terror on the bodies of Tonganese, on the whenua, the human body, the bodies of land, as crucial and essential to Western progress and expansion. The March of Surrender was a paradigmatic origin story in Tongan history that serves as a guide, shedding light and offering new directions for theorizing and understanding the monolithic representations of Tongan manhood that dominated the political stages in 2015 in Nuku'alofa and in 2009 in California. Relatives, I look at my time right now, I'm actually gonna go all the way down, okay? I'm gonna cut this talk. Please bear with me. Maybe we'll just take a deep breath. Sometimes I know that talking about violence is so difficult. So maybe we just take a deep breath. You know, I'll take it to Tongan Futurities. And I'll take it to this last image. We leave it at this one here, just because of our time. So thank you so much for bearing with me here. Okay, so this last one. So this last one here is, as you can see, it's, so this is a photograph, excuse me, come on, oops, nope. Please bear with me, guys. I'm actually just gonna cut a lot of this talk down. So this last image, these two images you see here, it's taken in 2019. Fortunately, just right before the COVID, right? Just right before COVID. So it's off the Protect Mauna Kea ceremony at the West Berkeley Shaman. So the last march, okay, so what I do at the last part, remember, if you could remember the thesis that I presented at the beginning of the presentation, right? So I look at the diaspora, right? And so one of the core arguments that I make is that I argue that the Tongan migrations that are facilitated through militarization, right? Through U.S. empire, excuse me, that are usually through the U.S. military, and then also the U.S.-based Mormon Church. I argue that these are contemporary, right? These are also contemporary renditions of the March of Surrender. And then the last part too is I show some of the wonderful work that's happening here in the Bay Area, right? Highlighting some of the beautiful work that the young people are doing throughout the Bay Area. Right, and this is the young people from Oceania, from Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Also, young African American, queer. I just really want to give a big shout out, right? And trans, working class communities that are all part of this Protect the West Berkeley Shaman movement. You know, I also have to say, I have to give a malo malangau malo e kapuke whanua to tribal chairperson Corina Gold, who's also here in our Talanoa space today. Because Corina Gold and her relatives, the Lishana Loni, are the original stewards, right? They're the indigenous stewards of this land that is now called the West Berkeley Shaman. Okay, so just take a look at those two images there. So the last part, the last march that I want to show, right? In this presentation, I show several examples of the diaspora of young people actually doing marches that refuse the March of Surrender, right? And this is one of them. This is one of the examples. The last march that I briefly discussed in this presentation is the 2019 Protect Mauna Kea ceremony at the West Berkeley Shaman in Berkeley, California. And you would be very excited to see that this final discussion also includes photographs. Okay, going down. The West Berkeley Shaman, just a little bit of information. The West Berkeley Shaman is the oldest Ohlone sacred site in the Bay Area. And in 2020, the National Trust for Historic Preservation placed the West Berkeley Shaman and the village site on their list of America's 11 most endangered historic places. Right? In addition, the Lishan Ohlone tribe are currently fighting against the desecration of the sacred site. The Mauna Kea movement, of course, has just brought so many, excuse me, I'm not pronouncing words right now. I'll just go to a new word, has actually brought so many of us together, right? Collectively throughout the world. Mauna Kea for Kanaka Maoli and Native Hawaiians is one of their most sacred sites. And so because it is one of the most sacred sites for our Kanaka Maoli relatives, it is therefore also, because of our vow with the Kanaka Maoli and our vow with our Moana Nui, this is also one of the most sacred sites that we share and support them in protecting. It is the birthplace of creation, and it is the tallest mountain, not just for the Pacific region, right, but throughout the world. Kanaka Maoli are standing against settler colonial forces and refusing the construction of the destructive $1 billion 30-meter telescope project, or the TMT, on their sacred Mauna Kea. So in this last story, relatives, of the last story, my discussion of the 2019 March at the West Berkeley Shaman, I ask you to come back with me, right? I ask you to come back with me to the 1840 origin story of the March of Surrender. As you can recall, the March of Surrender was performed by Tongan elder male leaders for the British gaze at the end of the long and violent battle where the Tongans fought to protect their sacred site. And the Tongans lost the battle. The sum of the losses for the Tongans were immeasurable and too many to name. The British massacred the unarmed bodies of the 300 Tongans. So relatives, if we can go back to that particular moment, right? So not only just the massacre of the 300 bodies, which are so important, but this is also the desecration of the very heart of Tonganness, which is the sacred site, the sacred ancestor, and also the burning down of the sacred temple. So in my telling of the story of these narratives of the West Berkeley Shaman, I begin by imagining myself, and I ask you to please also do this if you can, right? I begin by imagining myself standing and facing the images of the Tongan ancestors from 1840. In our meeting, I am not only standing in front of the Tongan male elders and warriors, but I imagine myself standing in front of the thousands of Tongan ancestors that includes women, grandmothers, aunties, restless children, newborn babies, and gender non-binary ancestors that were massacred, not just at the battle in Tokomololo, but their lives and blood was shed in the many battles and wars fought to defend themselves against the forces of right terror that ravaged Tonganness. And they courageously stood up and they courageously fought back because they refused to comply to the death sentence institutionalized by the British military and the Christian missionaries that centered the normalization of violence against the bodies of Tongan women and girls, and the normalization of the desecration of the sacred. Relatives, as I stand facing the Tongan ancestors, I am forced to contend with my answers to the questions that they ask me. I imagine that some of the questions that they ask goes something like this. They say, granddaughter Fui Fui Lupe, while your breath still runs in your brown Tongan body, tell us, what have you done with your time on our Mother Earth? And then I imagine another ancestor will come forward and ask me, and they will say, granddaughter, tell us, which marches and front lines do you align yourself with? Granddaughter, what front lines have you chosen to side with? And what front lines do you fight with? And what for? Then I imagine that the ancestors pause and they take a break, because you know, Tongan ancestors have their own time of doing things outside of Western time. And they don't always want it to be in a rush. And then, you know, after some time, you know, they have a few bowls of kava, they return to ask me the last questions. I imagine it goes something like this. Granddaughter, while your breath still runs in your brown Tongan body, what have you done with our original teachings, Dauhiba? Granddaughter, come closer and tell us a story about what you have done to protect the sacred. Relatives, in this conversation, I imagine that I fall and I put my whanua, my Tongan woman body on the whanua, on Mother Earth. Because it's a gesture of great humility, and perhaps it's also because I am afraid, because I don't have any adequate responses to their questions. I also imagine that after some while, that, you know, after a while, they pick up my body from the whanua and we cry together. And when the time is right, relatives, I will slowly reach into my pockets and pull out these two photographs from the ceremony to protect Mauna Kea, held at the West Berkeley Shell Mound in November 2019. And I would offer them these two photographs as offerings, as humble offerings, as humble offerings. I go just to the end. Part of the offering that I give them, relatives, is that I also read the names of all the young people and also the elders, the protectors of the sacred, that haven't lost their memory, that organized. So these photographs, I just want to say, especially this one here, there were about 300 people that came that day. These photographs are taken at the end. The ceremony took about 4 hours, right? And so most people with children, especially some of the elders, all had to go back home. But part of the offering to the ancestors also goes something like this. I place my hand on my Tongan heart, my whanua, or the lower part of my belly. This is the section that connects me to the whanua, our Mother Earth. And I read out the names. I read out the constellations of Va, the names of the protectors of the sacred, who created this front line, who stood in this front line, and who organized our communities for this front line. Some of them include Tonvai, queer Samoan man, protector of the sacred. Daufa Setefano, Tongan youth protector of the sacred. Toluk Ito, Bilawan youth protector of the sacred. Maxine Fanua, Tongan youth protector of the sacred. Lee Gawa, one of my Tongan homegirls, is also here today. Tongan woman educator, protector of the sacred. Keone Rodriguez, Mahu, queer, Native Hawaiian male, protector of the sacred. Samantha Damale, queer Tongan woman, protector of the sacred. Relatives, I recognize that we don't have the time. I'm gonna end. Please forgive me, there's so many names. This is all parts of the offering that I give back to the ancestors. After I read the names, I will weep, and my salt tears will invoke and tauhiva with my great grandmother, Amoana, our Pacific Ocean. And I will humbly say, ancestors, this is our humble offering. We have never forgotten you. Our memory is our front line and our commitment to tauhiva. Thank you so much, relatives. Excuse me, I've cried so much that I've messed up my glasses there. Well, if there's any questions, perhaps, this is the time for that, huh? Yes. Remember, easy questions and stuff like that?
So we welcome your questions, and since we also, and first of all, thank you so much, Fui. We really appreciate your sharing your presentation, and some of us had a chance to read a written version of it, and you're just very profound work with us. Thank you. And I was wondering if people wouldn't mind raising your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and if we could take clusters of questions. And because we started 5 minutes late, to extend this to at least 3:35. But we welcome your questions, and we'll take them in clusters in the interest of time. Could I ask that CRES faculty, could you reserve your questions for our conversation tomorrow? And I'll try to see, let me see who, if you raise your hand, Taylor will unmute you. Sorry, I'm trying to see. I don't have a, let's see.
Relatives, if you don't have a question, maybe you have a good story, I look at my homegirl and just a brilliant scholar there, Professor Shaista Patel. She has so many wonderful stories. I'm just looking at your beautiful face here, little sis. There's so many, there's just so many of you. Please forgive me please forgive me at this time for not mentioning you. Please also know that it is against Tongan Protocol. But I'm just so grateful. Thank you so much. The fact that you stayed here throughout this presentation, I want to recognize too that the themes that the presentation addressed are really difficult. They're really difficult. In part of the presentation that I didn't also give, I talked to my Tongan people, and I thank them, and I thank them for all that they've done in using the colonial projects and different strategies within the colonial project so that we could survive, so that we could still be here today. Right? I come from a family that I love, that have so much love and respect from my grandfather, Dr. Niumeitolu, who was also a Methodist preacher. Right? He was a Methodist preacher, and we're so proud in downtown Sayone, the Methodist church in downtown Nuku'alofa. we're so proud of that legacy as well. So I just want to say that to, you know, the Tongan and Pacific people. I recognize that ours is a shared struggle. Right? I also want to recognize the work, the important work and contributions that Tongan Christians have created with this colonial legacy. So
Fuli, there are 3 questions. Shaista, I hope you don't mind if I go on first name basis with everyone. Shaista, Samra, both have their hands up, and Taylor will unmute them. And there's also a question that was directed in the chat, and I received it, asking if you could expand more on invisibility. So that's one question. And Shaista or Samra, would you, actually, Taylor, would you mind unmuting them so they could pose their questions?
Thank you. I've been unmuted. I just want to say, as a settler scholar, I did not want to go first, and then Dr. Fui, you know, I felt like you know, I have a question, but so I apologize, but I don't need to be, you know, you don't need to respond to this right away. But I just wanted to ask you about your citation politics. I feel like there was so much love and care, right? Like your citation politics were like love letters to all of those academics who you mentioned. So I just wanted to ask you the decisions that you made in terms of thinking about whose work you're going to draw on. Yeah, I just really appreciated it, but that's what I want to say. Thank you.
oh, wow. Thank you so much, Professor Patel. Thank you so much. So much love and respect for you.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say, Auntie Fui Fui Lupe, you always bring your heart, and I'm so grateful to be able to sit here and listen and learn from you. I hope that everyone who's in this space today was able to really learn from Auntie Fui's humility. And I'm really grateful that I'm a scholar who's able to walk in your footsteps. And I hope that, like, moving forward, you just keep speaking, keep talking up, keep speaking out. I'm so grateful that you spoke today. You taught me a lot, so thank you.
So, well, malo, Anis. You know, I feel like this part of being highlighted is a difficult part for me. Because, you know, I'm thinking about somebody like Shaista Patel, who's just a brilliant scholar, and her work is so important to me and helps set kind of foregrounds a lot of the theorizing that I do. And then another person is a young scholar like you know, Ni Samara, who's now also doing graduate work at the University of Washington. You know, Samara, as you know, I think the world of you, right? The ways that you organize and you bring our people, right? Our people together. The ways also that you have so much patience, that I've seen you have so much patience with so many of us older people, right? You have so much love and this vision that you have for the world. So please forgive me, relatives, because this is how I respond. You know, like if you're gonna come in for our conversation, I also just want to offer something too, in the spirit of reciprocity, because both of you are also so important to me. And the theorizing, as we all know, right? As we all know, scholars, and you don't even have to be a scholar. Many of you here are such respected community leaders. The work that we do, none of it is on our own. None of it is on our own, right? And so really, I wanna pay tribute to so many of you that we're in conversation with, right? Oh, wow, Dr. Ocampo.
Here you go. Having a hard time with today. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's so beautiful. I think I just wanted to share my heart. I know that a lot of my work has been with my tribal community in Mexico, but also with the Chemehuevi people. And, you know, part of what brought us two very distinct, right, kind of transnational tribal communities is the importance of we're mountain people, they're mountain people, right? And we were doing a lot of work of preservation on our sacred sites, sacred mountains, So it was just so humbling and important for me to think about the ocean, right, as not just a space, but a landscape, because I'm always situated within mountains. So to think about the ocean and sacred waters in that way was very special to hear. And I think also the importance, right, of working within our communities as well as through, right, and among other tribal nations, um, just for our joint liberation, but also driven, right, by our cosmologies, our stories, our relatives, our families. So I just wanted to say thank you. It was very beautiful to hear you.
Oh, so great. Thank you so much for being here, Professor. And also, you're an amazing community leader with so much love for our young people. So really, it's a great honor to have you also as part of this Talanoa space.
Of course, thank you.
Lee, there's another question from Sandra Pacheco, and I wanted to say too that Humadar wrote in and said, amazingly brilliant and generous talk. Thank you for letting us witness.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, and so I get, if it's, I think that this will be the last question. Sandra, I think, let me see if I can unmute. Oh yeah, you should.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for taking my question, and thank you for sharing and the manner in which you shared first and foremost, Fifi. I know you well from similar journeys that we're on. And so my question is one that's about your process, your methods, because it's one that I struggle with. For those of us who have backgrounds with different ways of knowing, indigenous ways of knowing from our respective communities, in higher ed, we have this challenge of negotiating voice, negotiating perspective, negotiating ways of seeing and being in the world. And I'm wondering, in your process, how you navigated some of that, how you push towards through some of that complexity of having to hold both and.
It's so great to get that question from you, Dr. Pacheco, because you're just, as you know, or may not know, you're one of my role models, right? The fierce ways that you've also fought institutions and the courageous way you keep coming back, and just the grace and the sense of humor, right, that you have for our world. And, and everybody, I also wanted to say, when I was editing my dissertation, it was actually really my wonderful, wonderful role model here, who read and who gave me suggestions, and who did editing for my particular chapter on Chicana feminisms. So really, it's with great humility. It's with great humility. And, as a Tongan, I would say, who am I? Who am I to answer your questions? Maestra, who am I to answer the questions when I learned from you? And so I do it with humility then, if I can, just in our Talanoa space here. I do it with humility, because obviously you have so much knowledge. Maybe I'll answer that by answering it this way. I had some young Tongan scholars recently, some young scholars talk to me, and in our conversations, they talked about how the great shame they have because they cry, right? Because they can feel their scholarship, and when they're doing public presentations, they find themselves crying in public. And I remember that I heard them, and I thought to myself, well, Fui, you certainly cry, like you're totally a crier, and everybody knows that about you, right? And I guess this is how I answer it, doctor, is that there's, all these complications with here in the West. One of the things that my whole life, right, I would stand in front of the mirror and try my best not to cry. I would do it. I would try it. I would try my best. I would say, Fui, don't feel it. Don't feel it. Let it go by you. And I tried it for so long, and it never happened. Including, I even tried the medication with alcohol so that I couldn't feel. So one of the things that I told the young people is that you try and you try, so that you could look like you're a professional, quote unquote, of what they see as professional in the West. right? So you can present as this particular, objective person, like the white male model that they want us to be. But yet your body doesn't comply, and yet you can't. So what we do, and this is just my humble opinion, what we do is we take all of those things that are called weaknesses in the West, right? For us as Pacific people, I say this for the young people too, whether that's our big brown bodies, our big hair, our loud voices, whatever it is, right? And this is not just for Pacific scholars either, or Chicano scholars. This is for all of us, especially as Indigenous feminists, and also African-American feminists, right? Living in this moment of crisis. What we do is that we take all of those things that are called weaknesses in the West. For me, my crying is one of them. And we take it and we use it as our warrior stance. I say this because this is what I said to the young women. I said, young women, you can do all you want so that you don't cry, so that you don't feel your scholarship in the way that you do. Or you can do that, or we can take that as our warrior stance. So
thank you for your tears. Thank you for your tears. Every time we cry, we're giving others the space to release. And as my Indigenous grandmother, who was a healer, would say, if you do not cry, your body will be hurt and you will not heal. So thank you for being a role model that way. I appreciate you so much.
So much love and respect. And I really look forward to sharing a meal together. How with you and Jeff? It's been a minute.
I would love it. Much love from Oaxaca to you.
Oh my gosh, Oaxaca, wow. Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, wow.
So I just wanted to, thank you, Fui, and thank you everyone who joined. And there are messages in the chat. I'm gonna share one. So this is from Natalie Robertson.
Oh, Kiona.
Yes.
Kiona.
And so Natalie writes, our memory is our front line. Our Daliva love, so many powerful thoughts. My spirit is lifted and soars across the body of the Moana to greet you with Aroha. Yeah.
Well, relatives, maybe I know that all of you have such busy lives and this is the end. Maybe we can end with that. This is our sister Natalie Robertson, everybody. Actually a well-respected and a renowned photographer. And her work is so important because what she does is she tells narratives about the waters that are her ancestral waters, right? And she does it with not only just a fierceness of knowledges, right? And knowledges, but they're all in the work, so full of mana. Look at me, look at me, Natalie. I'm actually stopping myself from crying. This is so interesting. I just talked about crying, and yet I am trying to stop myself from crying. But Natalie and our vow was created here in Huichin, right? And also the Bay Area. We went to the Indigenous Peoples ceremony together. And Natalie actually gave an offering to the ancestors of this land from our ancestors from Tamuananui. So Natalie, beloved sister, it's a great blessing. Thank you for bringing our ancestors for Tamuananui here. And thank you, Malo e Tauhia Tauva, Natalie. Malo e Tauhia Tauva. So relatives, please forgive me for not recognizing so many of you that are here again. But I want to say thank you for your time, for your love. And I want to say, Malo, thank you. Malo e Tauhia Tauva. Thank you so much for recognizing the sacred in me. And I hope that I can recognize it. I hope I can reciprocate and also recognize the sacred in you. And thank you so much love. I see the Fijian brother over there, and I know he's here to make some funny jokes. But I have so much love, and I know that we're going on the Western time, and I want you guys to I want you to be able to do the other work the important work that you're here to do. So my Lord, Ofa, thank you so much for the great love. And I look forward to continuing to work together.